So it seems that if things get desperate for Ukraine, they could build a nuclear bomb in just mere months. The reason is simple, the reason is singular, and that reason is Putin. This nuclear bomb plan was presented to President Zelensky by Ukrainian Ministry of Defense in a briefing paper. So let's get into this briefing paper, see what the plans are, and then talk about if this is realistic or just a speculation. Best of all, we already have Putin's reaction on this that we covered once before, but Putin has basically come out and said that he's strongly against Ukraine having any kind of nukes. So like always, be sure to hit the like button down below to help us out with the algorithm, and let's begin. Now earlier, just before the BRICS summit that happened in Kazan, Russia, Putin was asked this exact question. What would Russia do if Ukraine pursued nuclear weapons? And this was his response. Let's listen.
This is another provocation. It is not difficult to create nuclear weapons in the modern world. I don't know if Ukraine can do it now. It's not so easy for today's Ukraine. But in general, there are no big difficulties there. It is obvious how to do it. So this is a dangerous provocation because any step in this direction will meet the appropriate reaction. This is secondly. Thirdly, and most importantly, the political leadership of Ukraine has repeatedly talked about it. Even before the crisis went into a hot phase, they had already stated earlier that, well, they stated so relatively mildly, but nevertheless they said that Ukraine should have nuclear weapons. Such a threat will get a corresponding reaction from the Russian Federation as well. I can state right away that Russia will not allow this under any circumstances.
Now, another thing that's kind of a coincidence is the same day the Ukrainian report got leaked was the same day NATO Military Committee Chair Rob Bauer stated something in an interview, or at least the day that clip went viral on social media. And he was basically explaining that the reason NATO troops are not in Russia kicking Russian troops' butts is because Russia has nuclear weapons. If it wasn't for nuclear weapons, NATO troops would already be deployed. Listen to it yourself.
I'm absolutely sure if the Russians did not have nuclear weapons, we would have been in Ukraine, kicking them out. We would have. But they have nuclear weapons, so it's not the same as in Afghanistan.
Now let's quickly go over the article. Now, article is a bit long and you can all go read it at the Times. It's not paid, you just need a subscription. So you give them your email and they'll show you the report. But basically what the article says that Ukraine has the capabilities to build a bomb similar to the one that US dropped on Nagasaki in just few months. But Ukraine doesn't have the capabilities to enrich uranium to create a nuclear reaction. So they will likely use plutonium that was extracted from fuel rods. Ukraine still has 9 operational nuclear reactors and they can get the fuel rods from these reactors. But then later on they clarified that the Ukrainian would still need a reprocessing plant to basically convert this plutonium into something that they can use in a nuclear bomb, and that plant will take years to build. So because of this, chances of Ukraine building a nuclear weapon, especially one in secret, is very, very low. On top of that, I don't think they have a political will to build a nuclear weapon because it might have some allies feeling some way if more and more countries get nuclear weapons, because then what's stopping other countries for arguing the same thing that they need nuclear weapons for their own security? What's more likely is this may be a negotiating leverage for Ukraine, where they're maybe sending a message to the future administration or even Russia that they have the capabilities to make nuclear weapon if they don't have proper security guarantees. In fact, this is something we talked about with Colonel Hamish Breton Gordon this morning, and here's the clip.
Well, I think there are two issues here that we should perhaps unpack. First of all, they are asking because of the concern that US aid might be withdrawn or at least pared down, and that's a concern for everybody. Especially this side of the pond, I can tell you. In the report in the Times and other reports around today are also sort of saying, well, Zelensky mentioned this a few weeks ago, and some of his team are saying, well, we could perhaps build a small nuclear weapon that we could take out airfields in Russia and stuff. Which to me is he's really aiming very much at the US, British and French governments saying, well, I wouldn't need a nuclear weapon if we had Storm Shadow missiles, ATACMS and Scalp and Taurus missiles that I could fire into Russia, sort of thing. So I think that seems to be the strategic message coming out of Kyiv. But if we look at the practicality of them building a nuclear weapon, well, until 1994, Ukraine was a nuclear nation. When it was still part of the Soviet bloc, they had 1,700 nuclear missiles, which is about 5 times what the UK has, and it's about a fifth of what the US has. So, very significant player. The Budapest Memorandum, signed between the US, UK and Russia, basically took those nuclear weapons off Ukraine on the proviso that those 3 countries would ensure the security of Ukraine. Now, obviously, that hasn't happened. So one can see why Zelensky, the Ukrainians, are pretty hacked off by it. So when it comes on to the practicalities of a nuclear device, well, I think everybody knows that Ukraine, from a nuclear power situation, is massive. Before the war, 60% of their power came from nuclear. They've got the largest nuclear power station in Europe, second largest in the world at Zaporizhzhia. So they've got a lot of nuclear isotopes, a lot of nuclear material they could use. The report published that the Times talks about is the Ukrainians saying they're going to use plutonium-239, and they can fashion it into a small basic nuclear weapon about a tenth of the size of the Fat Boy, which was the US nuclear bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki back in 1944. That bomb had a yield of about 21 kilotons, which is 21,000 tons of conventional explosive. What the Ukrainians are saying, they could do maybe 1 or 2 kilotons. So 1 or 2,000 tons of conventional explosive, that is still a massive bang. Now, could they do it? Well, they've got a lot of plutonium that they could use. In fact, the Fat Boy bomb only had 6 kilograms of plutonium. It's thought that Ukraine's probably got 7 tons of the stuff. However, this is plutonium, spent fuel from the nuclear power stations. In order to make it viable, it would need to be reprocessed. In other words, all the impurities and other chemicals around it would need to be removed. To do that, you need a reprocessing factory, which the Ukrainians currently don't have. There was a study done in the US in the 70s about the practicalities of making a small nuclear device with plutonium. The conclusion was it was possible. There are reports that it would take the Ukrainians 5 years to build a reprocessing plant, but there are other reports saying they could do it in 4 to 6 months. So I think in basic terms, and the other piece is one has to assume that with all the history of nuclear weapons that Ukraine's had, there must be a lot of corporate knowledge. There'll still be some scientists who know what to do. So I think if you put all that together, yeah, it is possible that Ukraine in 6 to 12 months could produce a small viable nuclear device based on plutonium that could yield about 1 or 2 kilotons. They probably have missiles and drones that they could launch it on. But to me, it's a messaging thing. If you stop helping us, we're going to have to go nuclear. And absolutely nobody wants that because, presumably if Ukraine fires a nuclear weapon into Russia, Russia's going to fire back nuclear weapons, with a lot more, which could then create a sort of a chain reaction, to use a nuclear expression, that would reverberate around the world. So, I personally hope that our governments listen to Zelensky and make sure that he has everything he needs to do. Because go back to our first point, if they can still hold that ground in Kursk by Christmas and Russia runs out of manpower, then the ceasefire that President Trump is talking about can happen on Zelensky's terms, not on Putin's terms.
Now, the big reason this topic has come up is because many around the world, many people who are pro-Ukrainian, are feeling a little uneasy since Trump was elected president because he's unpredictable, and many believe that he might try to force a peace deal on Ukrainian that Ukrainians might not be a fan of to fulfill his campaign promises. Now, this is something we talked about with Ben Hodges, General Ben Hodges, in our most recent podcast, so let's listen to that, and then we'll get into Zelensky denying that Ukraine has no plans to get nuclear weapons.
I do believe that President-elect Trump thinks that the United States has gotten a bad deal. I mean, if you think in terms of like a real estate guy or a business guy, that we've gotten a bad deal. Now, I believe that even though our European allies have not, many of them have not lived up to their obligations, especially some of the most wealthy ones like Germany and France and Italy and the Netherlands and Norway and Canada. The fact is, it's still in our interest, our advantage to be the leader in NATO because of the access we have in Europe. What that means for us in the Middle East and Africa, and because we need allies, we don't have enough capacity to do everything ourselves around the world. We need allies. And most of our best and most reliable allies come from Europe, as well as Canada and Australia, Japan, and South Korea. But it is a fair criticism for the president to say, hey, you guys have been able to have these enormous, wealthy social systems and healthcare and all these things for your people because you're not spending money on defense. The U.S. is doing it for you. That's unacceptable to the American people. And I think that's why Mr. Trump talks about, this is not, that the United States has not gotten a fair deal here. And that animates him, that animates his supporters. And so this is where I think it would be wise for Germany and other European leaders to say, Mr. President, don't turn your back on us, but I guarantee you we will do this and this and this because we need American leadership, we need American presence, just like you need German, French, Dutch, British, Polish capabilities. We will do that. And so I think there is room and opportunity, if you've got the right leadership in Europe, to actually move towards changing that perception of the U.S. not getting a good deal, and that could take pressure off the United States, actually, so that we can focus on China. I think Europe being proactive instead of complaining about Trump or the U.S. or wringing their hands would be a positive development.
YouTube is still not a fan of a lot of topics we cover, and that means the videos get restricted and demonetized. That's why we recently launched memberships and Patreons. This way you guys can support the content we make directly if you're able to. Because we want to continue covering this type of topics even if advertisers don't like it. We like doing it and hopefully you guys like watching it. That's why Patreon and memberships give us a way to continue doing this without worrying about YouTube demonetizing our videos. So if you're interested and you're able to support us, you can do so by joining our Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. The QR codes will be on the screen and the links in the description. Your support is greatly appreciated. Ukraine wants nuclear weapons to protect itself against Russia. At least that was the news all day yesterday because of what Zelensky said. Watch it yourself.
So how can we believe in this document? And how can we trust all the partners who guaranteed the protection of our territorial integrity and sovereignty? The answer is very simple. Does it work? No, this document does not work. Do the other major partners' agreements with Russia work? No. These were not only agreements between Ukraine and Russia, but also between Ukraine and all its partners, so in general. All these agreements did not work out. Which of these big countries, all the nuclear powers, were affected? All of them? No, only Ukraine. Who gave away the nuclear weapons? All of them. No, only one. Who? Ukraine. Who is at war today? Ukraine. And so, it turns out that in a conversation with Donald Trump, I told him it works out this way. What is the solution? Or Ukraine will have nuclear weapons, and then it will be a defense for us. Or we should have some kind of alliance, NATO. We do not know any effective alliances today. The NATO countries are not at war today. NATO members are not at war. In NATO countries, people are all alive, thank God. And that is why we choose NATO, not nuclear weapons. We are choosing NATO.
Now, as every media was reporting on this, claiming that Zelensky just said Ukraine wants nukes, Putin came right out to say that Russia is not gonna accept it. I'll show you guys that in just a second, but first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. Our videos criticizing Russia are sometimes downvoted by Russian bots, so your likes help us out tremendously in the algorithm. Now, first, I do want to provide some background as to what Zelensky just said. He talks about the Budapest Memorandum. It was signed by the US, UK, and Russia. All three countries provided Ukraine with security guarantees in return for Ukraine returning the nuclear bombs, the nuclear weapons that it had from Soviet eras. You see, when Soviet Union fell apart, there were 4 countries that inherited the whole nuclear stockpile. One of them being Russia, and other 3 were Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Now, Belarus and Kazakhstan didn't have much to begin with, but they also quickly returned everything to Russia. But Ukraine was little hesitant, and on top of that, Ukraine had the 3rd largest stockpile of nuclear weapons after US and Russia. Now, Ukraine didn't want to give this up. They were actually having debates in their parliament because the officials strongly believed that if they were to relinquish the nuclear weapons, they would likely come under attack by Russia. With benefit of hindsight, safe to say, they were exactly on point. But at that point, US and the West was extremely worried about all this nuclear stockpile that Ukraine had, mainly because what was going on in Yugoslavia. As Yugoslavia was falling apart, US didn't want Ukraine to become another Yugoslavia with nuclear weapons. So it pushed heavily for Ukraine to give up its nukes. In return, US, UK, and Russia gave Ukraine security guarantees. If Ukrainian borders were to be breached, everyone involved will provide Ukraine with assistance to maintain its sovereignty. So that's exactly what President Zelensky is referring to. If Russia didn't respect the document it signed at Budapest Memorandum, how can Ukraine expect Russia to follow any future peace deal that is signed? That's why President Zelensky says, only way for a country like Ukraine to be safe from Russia is to either have nukes or be in NATO. And then he goes on to add that Ukraine doesn't want nukes. It chooses the NATO path. It wants to be in NATO. Here, listen to the last part again, because I really want to emphasize this. He says this in the end in the clip.
In NATO countries, people are all alive. Thank God. And that is why we choose. And that is why we choose NATO, not nuclear weapons. We are choosing NATO.
Now, of course, Putin was not gonna let this news go to waste. He used it again to remind the West that Russia is a superpower. Here, listen to it yourself.
This is another provocation. It is not difficult to create nuclear weapons in the modern world. I don't know if Ukraine can do it now. It's not so easy for today's Ukraine. But in general, there are no big difficulties there. It is obvious how to do it. So, this is a dangerous provocation because any step in this direction will meet the appropriate reaction. This is secondly. Thirdly, and most importantly, the political leadership of Ukraine has repeatedly talked about it. Even before the crisis went into a hot phase, they had already stated earlier that, well, they stated so relatively mildly, but nevertheless they said that Ukraine should have nuclear weapons. Such a threat will get a corresponding reaction from the Russian Federation as well. I can state right away that Russia will not allow this under any circumstances.
But at the end of the day, Ukraine was never saying that it's pursuing nuclear weapons. Zelensky was just recalling a conversation he had with former President Trump, and that's why he used the word nukes. At the end of the day, even end of the clip, he says that we want NATO, Ukraine wants NATO, and that's the path they choose. But just a day after, or maybe the same day, I'm not sure, but the first speech was at the EU summit, but at the NATO summit in the same city, he got asked this during a press conference, and this is what he had to say.
Mr. President, you just made it clear at the EU summit that the question of nuclear weapons would arise for Ukraine if it cannot become a NATO member. So in this context, can you tell us how long it would take for Ukraine to build a nuclear bomb? And a question to the Secretary General, would you understand if Ukraine were to build a nuclear bomb if it cannot become a NATO member? Thank you.
Sometimes we create ourselves problems. Now you began to do it. So we never spoke about that we are preparing to create nuclear weapon or something like this. I said that when Budapest Memorandum was signed by very honorable nuclear, very powerful nuclear countries, there was written that Ukraine gives nuclear weapon and Ukraine will have from these very respectable countries, including those time Russia, China, United States, including them. Yes, that we will have our secure territorial integrity and sovereignty. That's what I said. And I said, so it meant that we gave nuclear and these people who've been partners those time, they had to give us security guarantees. And if after that Putin began this occupation, not once, during all these years, during the revolutions, during 10 last years, 2 times during last 10 years, it means that it's not very good umbrella for our security. That's why I said I don't have alternative except NATO. That was my signal. But we don't do nuclear weapon. Please, don't move these messages.
Now, important to note, during the Budapest Memorandum, China and France were not part of it. They didn't sign that document. But they did provide Ukraine assurances in a separate deal. It wasn't as strong, that deal, compared to the Budapest Memorandum, but it was there. And that's why he brought up China too. Another interesting story here, when Ukraine did have nuclear weapons, they just had the physical nuclear weapons. They did not have the codes to launch them. The codes were still in Moscow or the central of Soviet Union, wherever that was, and Ukraine didn't have it, Russia had it. But it was pretty much expected that if Ukraine kept the weapons, they could have figured out a way to use them. Either they could just take away the warhead, attach it to something else, or somehow, some way, they could have figured it out. Now, of course, Ukraine has made it abundantly clear they don't want to promote this nuclear fear-mongering. But you know one country that is promoting a nuclear fear-mongering? It's Russia. Every time any question comes up on how West should help Ukraine win this war or give them a fighting chance in this war against Russia, who's just using everything at their disposal except nuclear weapons, the whole Russian government is quick to remind the world that Russia has nukes and it's not afraid to use it. This is something we covered recently, so let's get into that segment. But before that, as this story is living proof, sometimes traditional media gets geopolitical story just so wrong. That's because most of them are not good at properly covering important geopolitical news. That's why we launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important news in a simplified manner. Every evening, we send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Trust me, I do it every single day. Best of all, this is completely free and you can sign up right now by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on your screen. Sign up today and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in.